Good evening and welcome to friends and members of the Midcoast Symphony. I'm Rohan Smith. I'm the music director of the Midcoast Symphony, and I'm here this evening in a conversation with my friend and colleague George Lopez. This is the first of three conversations we're planning in lieu of our regular concert series with soloists who have collaborated with the orchestra over recent years. And this evening I'm going to be talking to George about another George, George Gershwin, whose Rhapsody in Blue we performed with George Lopez in 2009. Welcome, George. Great to have you here.
Oh, great to be here in a piece that I've played just about my whole performing career, and it was a thrill to work on it with you guys back in 2009.
Oh, it's great to have you, George. Just before I get going, we would like to thank various sponsors of the Midcoast Symphony for their continuing support, especially at this time when regrettably, of course, our performances are suspended. We'd like to thank, first of all, our underwriters, New England Cancer Specialists and the Highlands, our season sponsors, Bath Savings, HM Payson, and Lamy Wellahan Shoes, and our concert sponsors, Berman and Simmons Trial Attorneys, LL Bean, and Norway Savings Bank. Thank you all. We can't tell you how much we value and appreciate your support for orchestral music in the Mid-Coast. So, George and I are going to talk about the Rhapsody in Blue, which is a piece of music which has had an enormous influence and impact on American music culture. George, you've performed this piece many times, right? And
Yeah, I have.
tell us a little about what you think about the importance of this piece in American musical history.
One of the things. Well, I've played this piece in all of its versions, and I remember specifically one year. It may, in fact, have been the year that we did it with Midcoast. That I had to play all three versions. Well, there are more than three, but the three main versions are the original jazz arrangement that Grofe helped to put together. Then there's, of course, the orchestral symphonic version that Grofe orchestrated 5 years, after Gershwin actually passed away, published it. And then there's the solo piano version with piano accompaniment that Gershwin himself, or rather the two piano version, and then there's a solo version. And it's easy to get confused between the three because each one has certain cuts and different sections. And so it's a fascinating thing to consider that in whatever version the Rhapsody shows up, whatever cuts are made, whatever things are added or taken away, it's one of the few works that survives every single manipulation and manifestation of the piece. Bernstein is the one that really recognized this and wrote about it in an interview and in his writings about how somehow the Rhapsody remains the Rhapsody no matter what you do to it somehow.
Yes.
And that shows the strength of the spirit of this piece.
Um, George, to get a little background, maybe we could speak about who George Gershwin was as a person. George Gershwin was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. He was born in 1898 in Brooklyn, and apparently he had an extraordinary capacity for memory, both a photographic memory and an absolute total recall as a musician. And
Yes.
his parents realized that along the way because he wasn't very interested in schoolwork. And he left school at the age of 16 and basically started working on Tin Pan Alley in what is called, I think, what's the term? He had to play music to publicize sheet music. He would basically sit in a room and play song after song after song. So he was in the know with what was going on in popular music in that time. And of course, it was the jazz age, the age of jazz, and the young George Gershwin spent a lot of time in speakeasies where all the great jazz musicians were playing. And he soaked up the blues and ragtime. He was influenced by Irving Berlin. So he was in this mix of the 20s. Um, George, what do you recall about the influences on the young Gershwin?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about all of that. It's incredible to think that uh, Scott Joplin and Gershwin, who we don't have any evidence that they ever met, but they were living in New York at the same time. I mean,
Right.
Gershwin was rather young, and he had just had his first big hit, Swanee, when Joplin passed away. So it's
Right.
incredible to think. I mean, whether he saw or met Joplin or not, Gershwin knew the music, obviously. Uh,
Um, George, do you know of a pianist called Eubie Blake, African American jazz pianist? Apparently, he was very influential on the young Gershwin.
Extremely much,
Yeah.
yeah.
From what, yes, apparently he was an extraordinary exponent of ragtime, and he would walk into the store, the music store where Gershwin was working, and told him that he didn't really know how to play ragtime, and he put him through the mill, and I think that's where Gershwin got some of his ragtime and blues chops. Um, well, George, let's talk about the actual background of the commissioning of Rhapsody in Blue by Paul Whiteman. Whiteman was one of the most famous band leaders, along with Fletcher Henderson, uh, and his goal, in a way, was to make jazz music respectable by putting it into concert halls and making it a form of art music. And he had the most extraordinary orchestra of astonishing players. And Paul Whiteman was also interested in modernism because, of course, Stravinsky was around and Ravel and all of those other great modernists, and they were interested in jazz. So Whiteman was really interested in capitalizing on that and creating a piece of music that would um, represent the transformation of jazz into art music. So he got Gershwin to agree to write this piece. Now, George, what actually happened? Tell us what I think. Didn't Gershwin forget about the whole thing?
not only did he forget, but he actually rejected the idea of doing a concerto at all. Whiteman asked him for essentially what was a jazz concerto that would demonstrate sort of the best of what America had to offer on the world stage. And Gershwin just didn't think it was a good idea. And it wasn't so much that he forgot about it, he simply rejected it until January 4th. He was playing billiards with a buddy of his
Yeah.
on the Upper West Side, and all of a sudden Ira Gershwin comes in and shows them the newspaper, the local newspaper, where he says Paul Whiteman has announced that Gershwin is going to present a jazz concerto on this experiment in American music not 5 weeks hence. So Gershwin was really put on the spot, and his hand was forced, literally, to write this piece, which
Right.
he sort of handed parts to Freddie Grofé about 8 days before the actual concert, which took place on February the 12th, 1924. His part wasn't even written down.
George, tell us about how did the name Rhapsody in Blue come about?
Oh, that's a great story. He actually toyed with a number of titles, and before settling on Rhapsody in Blue, the original title that was going to go to publication was An American Rhapsody, or simply American Rhapsody. James Whistler, who was a world-renowned artist and painter at the time, had a full exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art uh, earlier that year, and Ira Gershwin had gone to see it. Some of you may know that George Gershwin himself was a great lover of art and himself a very accomplished painter. We have a famous portrait that Gershwin did of the amazing Viennese and very impactful Viennese composer and theorist Arnold Schoenberg, a very famous portrait. But Gershwin missed the Whistler exhibit, and Ira went and came back and said, you know, Whistler is using these wonderful musical titles like Nocturne and Blue and Gray and, you know, Sonata, and, you know, for the titles of paintings. And so as a result, Gershwin was inspired to maybe find a more creative, interesting, and somehow blend music and art in his title, Rhapsody in Blue.
Oh, that's an amazing, isn't that an amazing story? I mean, and of course, it ties in with the element of blues that's in the music. So, George, can you tell us let's get into the music itself.
Sure.
And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the five themes in the music. I've forgotten what they are. Can you refresh? Can you tell our audience about the five themes?
Yes,
Maybe you
absolutely.
could play us for them.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. You know, I mean, there are so many fun stories around this piece. Everything from its commission to Gershwin sort of, you know, reeling it out in 3 weeks' time, to not having all the parts ready, to and this one is particularly, and it reminds me of a statement we have of Mozart, where he writes to his father that he could hear and see an entire symphony in his head at once. This is exactly what Gershwin says about the moment he conceived of the Rhapsody as he was riding a train from New York to Boston, where he was going to be performing. He talks about how he conceived and heard the entire piece from beginning to end, and that the train ride itself, with all of its rattly and steely rhythms, he uses that term, sort of inspires that very cosmopolitan, he calls it a metropolitan madness, a kaleidoscopic, sort of the music as a kaleidoscope of America. And so what we have is, it's a quilt of these wonderfully expressive and very iconic themes, of which there are five. The five are what scholars call the ritornello, or in other words, the theme that continues to come back and sort of are the main pillars of the entire structure. Ritornello simply meaning returning idea. The second, and that one is of course the iconic. Then you have the theme that was inspired by the ride itself. It's known as the train theme. You know, you can hear the chugga of the wheels on the tracks. Wonderful. Then this is where your sort of bringing in U.B. Blake becomes very important, because with ragtime, which Gershwin, you know, he fed at the trough of ragtime. New York was the hub of ragtime, at least on the East Coast. There was a West Coast version, but, you know, Joplin was in New York, and so you get the classic, you know, of ragtime, everything. And this Oompa Oompa, which of course you can trace back actually to the Ottoman Empire, we'll get into that some other time. In terms of the history of marching bands, the Oompa comes from the march, which evolves into, of course, Sousa's famous marches. And by the way, John Philip Sousa was at the premiere of the Rhapsody, which is amazing to think about, as was
along with all the glitterati and artists it was the high and low of New York Musical Society, all there in the Aeolian Hall on that night.
Extraordinary. Rachmaninoff, who was a great fan of Gershwin, Stravinsky was there. I mean, it's unbelievable.
With Chrysler.
Yeah, so U.B. Blake's ragtime influence comes out in this third theme known as the stride. Striding means just, you know, you're sort of striding left, right. So it's... Very, I mean, you know, striding. The fourth theme is known as the shuffle, Of course, dance music was so big back then, so shuffling your feet rapidly. So this is. That's the shuffle. And then finally, of course, the iconic theme that Gershwin almost left out. It was only on the encouragement of Ira to create some lyrical contrast to the Rhapsody that Gershwin included this most famous of themes, known as the love theme. So it's incredible to imagine the Rhapsody in Blue without that theme, but it almost didn't show up. Another one of those great stories.
George, that's so incredible to get that detailed background on what went into the piece. It's really interesting because there's been an ongoing argument and discussion about whether the Rhapsody in Blue is just a so-called formless, just assemblage of melodies and tunes, or whether it's an actual well-constructed piece of music. And I can't see how this piece, having lasted so long and it being so successful, how it does not have a coherent structure. So I think that has stood the test of time. If we go back to that premiere, it's really interesting because a couple of things happened. George Gershwin himself really was not a jazz musician in the purest sense of the word. He was a songwriter and a composer in the sort of tradition of Irving Berlin. But the raw material and what went into the piece, no question about its jazz origins. And what happened in this meeting between Paul Whiteman's orchestra and Gershwin is that these extraordinary musicians in the orchestra, I don't know, George, do you remember the names of some of those players? The clarinetist, what was his name? The guy who invented the...
That's right. His name was Ross Gorman.
Yeah, so apparently when Gershwin first played the lick that has become famous with the glissando, there was no glissando. And Ross Gorman invented it on the spot, and Gershwin said, "Oh, I love that. Let's put that into the score."
Incredible.
And then all the trombone, the trumpeter with the wah-wah mute and the muted trombone, and I think there are all sorts of crazy instruments that don't even exist anymore unless you go back and look at the original scores. Slide whistle, a heckelphone, a sopranino saxophone, and Gershwin actually hadn't finished the parts when they performed it, so he made up a lot of the music on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, the folk jazz element that he was trying to incorporate within what was really a very composed piece of music. The accordion, for example. You mentioned saxophones, which are more known to exist in jazz ensembles. And of course, the banjo, which is included. Although an optional instrument, it definitely, the inclusion of it gives you an indication of sort of the spirit of the piece itself, where Gershwin's mind was. No, you're absolutely right. And the different styles that he draws upon, I think Gershwin is maybe the first true cross-pollinated composer. And he was...
It's such an amazing thing to contemplate in that he, with this piece, created a kind of cultural synthesis of African-American music, of Russian Jewish music, no question, because his roots were in the Yiddish theater and the early musical comedy of Broadway. It was an astonishing mix that he created. So listen, how about we switch gears a little bit and talk about the different interpretations and the various, because the Rhapsody has been through several stages of evolution.
Even within Gershwin's lifetime, for that matter.
Yes. So what if we start by listening to the very first recording? Of course, there are the piano roll recordings, but there is one recording made by Gershwin with the Paul Whiteman band. It's a sort of abridged version, only 9 minutes long. and it's from 1924, and Ross Gorman is playing that clarinet solo,
That's
and you
right.
can really hear the authentic jazz style of these instrumentalists. And Gershwin, paradoxically, sounds kind of like the straight man in the mix. It's
Yeah.
the orchestra who are the ones, the jazzy ones. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen, and I'm going to hopefully do this in such a way that we hear the sound well. Uh,
As
so
you're
here we
transitioning,
go.
yeah, as you're transitioning to that, just one interesting comment about Ross Gorman's opening, and that is that even though he wasn't particularly knowledgeable about Jewish music, or he wasn't Jewish himself, there is a klezmer-like approach to the way he bends the notes in the opening of the solo.
Oh
I
yeah.
almost felt like he was tipping his hat to Gershwin's past, and of course being the son of two Russian Jewish immigrants in Brooklyn, not too far, by the way, from where I grew up in Brooklyn. So let's have a listen.
Okay.
Ah, great.
So, George, tell us, what are you hearing in this this performance?
Oh, um, definitely your comment about Gershwin being the straight man compared to the really the true vaudevillian comic approach. That I mean, Gorman's glissando was just a gaffe. He was just fooling around when he did that. They were in rehearsal, just probably drinking and having a great time. So the idea that Gershwin let that in is not far-fetched because he himself had had some vaudeville successes in the more recent years. I mean, he met Paul Whiteman, having done, the Scandals of 1922. on vaudeville. So there's a wonderful comic element to Gorman and to all of them. For that, I mean, when the trumpet comes in with the wah-wah, the trombones, vaudeville is very much in the spirit of all those performances. And we're maybe a little bit more familiar with that for those of us of a certain generation through the playing of Chico Marx, for example, of the Marx Brothers. He loved doing these funny little things where he'd do a gliss and he would do these funny, so there is a comic genre of piano playing in this era. So that's really fun. Of course, you heard the wonderful lyricism that Gershwin demonstrates right at the beginning. I mean, he really is trying to separate what the piano quality is from the rest of the orchestra right from the get-go. I mean, the very lush, almost, I mean, I'm sure Rachmaninoff loved hearing, so there's some wonderful things happening in that opening. What a great performance.
So look, let's discuss this piece has been through several evolutions, and of course, if we think about it, the jazz age did not really survive that long. At the end of Prohibition and the Great Depression, there was a tendency to go for the kind of Hollywood sound, a much more schmaltzy sound. The movies came in, so that bright, improvised, jazzy dance hall kind of feel gave way to a much more Hollywood style. And if we jump forwards actually to 1959, there's a recording of Leonard Bernstein, which represents the polar opposite, which is really an orchestral concert version, where everything is much more stretched out. The swinging quality is not as strong. And it almost represents, I mean, I think it's the alpha omega sort of difference that is now would not be done, because I think we've sort of returned to a desire for authenticity. But Bernstein stretched out and sort of underlined every theme. Let's listen to a little bit of this recording with the New York Philharmonic.
Yeah, I'll talk after. Very good.
Yes, okay. Just give me a second to get it going.
They use a plunger for that.
So George, do you find this one to be different? Look, actually, the first thing I wanted to mention is that this, of course, is a different orchestration also by Groffet. And some of our listeners and audience may know that Groffet, of course, was the composer of the Grand Canyon Suite. And he was Paul Whiteman's orchestrator. And the first arrangement, of course, that we just heard before this was just for a jazz band. And the parts of that have been locked up for years, and only a few friends and colleagues of ours, George, have been able to get access to those parts. But this version we just heard now is the full symphony orchestra version that was done by Ferdinand Groffet. What do you hear as different?
You know, something came to mind that I just thought of, and that is that Bernstein himself, at this point in his own career, was at the height of his most didactic spirit. The Young People's Concerts were a total hit, a total sellout. He felt it in many ways like Stanislavski in Moscow felt about saving theater in 1900. Bernstein felt the same impulse to save classical music, to save serious music in the mid-20th century. So 1959 was at the height of his sort of teaching and professorial mentality. And it just occurred to me that it may have something to do with his more strict, because, you know, West Side Story had just premiered. I mean, actually, no, it was about to be premiered. I think early 60s, or maybe it was the 50s. It had already been conceived and thought of in any case. I'm getting my timing off. But there's nothing more American than West Side Story. So this performance of the Rhapsody feels to me more archival in a way, and rather square, beautifully classical. And it could be that Bernstein is also recognizing Gershwin's desire to be taken seriously also. Maybe Bernstein's sensibilities felt that pushing it toward jazz, where at this point in American music history, there was a real divide between what was thought of as highbrow and lowbrow music, or serious music and popular music. And so there are so many layers to why Bernstein chose to do this version. But I think he was also aware, as you mentioned earlier, that Gershwin went to Paris and tried to study with some of these great composers. The only one that actually took Gershwin on for a very brief time, unsuccessfully, was, to most people, a rather obscure French composer that you and I are aware of, Jacques Ibert. Jacques Ibert actually tried to teach Gershwin something. It didn't work. Nadia Boulanger, who had groomed Aaron Copland and finished up his training the year Rhapsody was premiered in 1924, refused to teach Gershwin, as did Ravel, saying better to be a first-rate Gershwin than a second-rate Ravel, you know.
Correct. Yes, it's amazing. Yeah. So maybe Bernstein, in a way, was trying to be a professor and a teacher. It's so interesting because there's a wonderful conversation between Bernstein and Duke Ellington, in which they talk about the way that their paths are converging to bring out to give birth to a new style of American music. And the way Bernstein put it was, he said to Duke, he said, "Well, Duke, you're a composer of symphonic jazz, and I'm a composer of jazz symphonies."
Yeah.
At this point, they're beginning to sound like the same thing. So it's really fascinating exchange. So look, George, let's move on. There's another stage. If we consider the first stage, the original stage, then we've got the Hollywood stage, and then we're returning to a desire for authenticity. And there was at this time, of course, you can think of some of the composers who were so influenced by jazz. Darius Milhaud with La Création du Monde,
Yeah.
Stravinsky, L'Histoire du Soldat, Kurt Weill with his Threepenny Opera.
Amazing.
And all of these modernists really were trying to get away from the pop style. And Michael Tilson Thomas, of course, who came from a family who were involved in the Yiddish theater and had himself studied with Stravinsky and had absorbed all of these styles. He was very much a proponent of returning to a more original interpretation of the Rhapsody. So let's hear a little bit of MTT's version. And I think what we want to be listening for is that there is a quality of trying to bring back the orchestral freedom in the jazz solos,
Yeah.
and it's faster and brighter and leaner and meaner.
Great.
Moment, I've just got to get everything up here. We go. So George, I hear a little bit of a similar approach to the music that you have when I've done this piece with you. That freshness and liveliness in the music that comes out in this recording. Are you
Um,
hearing some of that?
yeah, I'm a great fan of this recording. And, having studied so many of the recordings, and particularly the original ones, it's clear that Michael Tilson Thomas has listened to Gershwin perform this. I mean, they almost take the tempos of the 78s, which of course are as fast as they are to
Yeah,
fit more
right.
material on, the cylinders that they had, which you couldn't put a lot of music on. But the spirit of of Gershwin's original definitely comes through in some of the quirky timings and, for example, his approach to this particular theme. Uh, that's so typical of sort of the vaudevillian comic approach that we were talking about earlier. It's just, you're winking at the audience, you're sort of looking around, you're just having so much fun with it. And he really brings that aspect of Gershwin out. It does make it lighter in character. And I think this is the conflict. It's interesting to put Bernstein's recording and MTT's recording side by side because in a way it puts the two alter egos, kind of like Schumann's Florestan and Eusebius. Bernstein, the more slightly buttoned up symphonic Hollywood version versus MTT's lighter, quirkier, sort of off the cuff version. Because Gershwin himself had this conflict of being taken seriously on the one hand, and on the other hand, totally being himself. Which was spontaneous and fresh. And, he was a great womanizer. He was an amazing athlete. He painted. His interests went in remarkable directions. I mean,
Well,
incredible.
George, that's a great segue into the next stage of the evolution of the Rhapsody, which is that there are a number of jazz performances of the Rhapsody. And what has taken place is that great jazz musicians, starting with Duke Ellington, decided to reclaim Rhapsody in Blue as a jazz work because, of course, its origins are in jazz. So And the most extraordinary, I think the most extraordinary one of these is Duke Ellington's version. There's a Herbie Hancock has recorded the Rhapsody, and then of course there's the extraordinary younger pianist Marcus Roberts. But let's listen to a bit of Duke Ellington's. We'll just hear the beginning of it. The Duke actually flips all the tunes around backwards, so the clarinet comes in at the end. It's only 5 minutes long. He takes out the glissandos, but he turns it back into jazz.
Yeah.
So
Wonderful.
it really swings.
Wow. Wow.
Isn't that remarkable?
That is
Isn't
truly.
that extraordinary? You know, what is really interesting about this recording is that Duke Ellington turns away from Gershwin's decision to play with a lot of different tempi. So the original performance and all the original recordings have huge variation in tempi. And one of the things about jazz performances, usually the music stays in one tempo,
Yeah.
one song from beginning to the end. And he substantially does that in this remarkable um, version of the Rhapsody,
Yeah.
keeping it in one. It's so that it can swing all the way through. It's the only one that really, really swings.
Another thing that I think is really important, this recording comes 3 years after the Bernstein that you played,
Yeah,
which was
1962.
1969, this is 1962. And because of the iconic nature of this piece, especially as the advent of recording really began in Gershwin's time and improved throughout each decade, every recording somehow has to clear some space for itself. It reminds me of the literary theorist from Yale, Harold Bloom's theory of the anxiety of influence, where, you know, each new generation has to kill the former generation to make room for itself. So, point being that what was Ellington going to record yet another jazz version as, you know, as MTT did, as Michael Tilson Thomas did a decade later, or, you know, do a sort of classical version. So I think This is very genre specific. It's a bit of a throwback at this point in music history. I mean, the swing era had pretty much ended in the early 50s. Then you had bebop and all this other, free jazz was, Ornette Coleman was at his height at this point with, LSD and reef. And it was incredible. So for Ellington to do this in 1962 is amazing and speaks to his audience, whereas Bernstein was speaking to his audience. So you begin to bring in some very interesting ethnographic and political elements to how these recordings came about.
Well, George, I think that can bring us to Marcus Roberts. Marcus Roberts is an extraordinary African American jazz pianist who happens to be blind, by the way,
Yeah.
and performs very frequently with jazz at Lincoln Center. He's become a kind of an icon at this point.
Yeah.
And his version of Rhapsody in Blue is just remarkable. So let's just talk about that a little bit. It's really a recreation of the Rhapsody in Blue in a jazz as true jazz. It's much more loose. It really questions the original piece, but at the same time as honoring it. It has long improvised solos. He changes the harmony. It's much, much more free. And he really returns it. He's taken it back into the fold of jazz completely. It's also about almost double the length of the original.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah. So let's listen to a little bit of Marcus Roberts, and then we can talk about it a little bit before we finally finish with George Lopez. Okay. Let me see. Sorry, just got to remember to share my sound.
Habanera.
I wish we had more time to listen to more of it.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Isn't that astonishing?
Oh my gosh. And this could in fact be in the true spirit, if not always the letter of this piece. I mean, let's just list. I made a list of the different genres, the different styles of music that are in the original that inspired. The idea that Gershwin heard the whole thing at once also means that every part of him must have been involved. So you have ragtime, stride piano, which is similar but more contemporized version, blues, novelty piano, which was a sort of very show-offy. I mean, essentially, Gershwin was a novelty pianist, and that's a very specific. The other famous person was Zez Confrey, who was also in that concert with Rhapsody in Blue, most famous for his dizzy fingers. Vaudevillian comedy piano, a la Chico Marx or Jimmy Durante. So, you know, in the spirit, he collects all the styles available to him. And in a sense, Marcus Roberts is doing the same thing, bringing in swing. And even, I sense a little bit of a funk feeling even in one part. And of course, you know, more contemporary styles of jazz. So, I don't know, it's interesting. Great recording.
George, we're almost out of time. So let's just finish off our session today with a taste of your performance of Rhapsody in Blue with the Mid-Coast Symphony Orchestra that I had the pleasure and honor of conducting in 2009. And we'll just hear the last few minutes, the famous love theme before we bid our audience good evening. I've got to just get the screen share going again. I mean, let's see, where is it? I don't hear anything yet. I'm afraid I've lost our sound. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm having a technical difficulty.
All right, that's okay.
I don't know what it is. Let's just see what's happening here. The sound has just vanished completely.
All right, well, can you hear me at least?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay, good.
This is so strange. I do apologize.
That's all right. I'll play us out.
Why don't you play us out, George? Okay.
You know, one thing about talking about the Rhapsody in Blue is that it has survived. We're coming upon 100 years. Actually, we're coming upon the centennial of its origins. And it's still such an important piece of music. I mean, think about all the music that's been composed that hasn't survived. One thing I also wanted to bring up about the year of its composition was the fact that it was a year both that Aaron Copland had returned from Paris to start his new project of developing a truly American music. And of course,
Yes.
he was thinking of it from the artful classical side. He had just studied with Nadia Boulanger for several years, as later did Leonard Bernstein. And he was on a mission, as was, by the way, another iconic musician in New York at the time who would come from Chicago, Louis Armstrong.
Yes.
So although not formal, there was a kind of a battle going on about what was going to be real American music. And the divide between the classical and popular genres really began at this time. And Gershwin embodied the conflict. He rode the surf, the wake, if you will, between these two things. And it was why, I believe, ultimately Ken Burns decided not to include Gershwin in his, 10-part jazz series. He mentions Paul Whiteman's influence on the music scene of New York, but Gershwin is only peripherally mentioned as being playing in the Rhapsody in Blue on that night in 1924. So it's a very rich moment in American history, and to think that Gershwin was 25 years old when he composed that and really didn't know himself yet as a composer, although he will only always be remembered for that piece.
Now, now, George, I just solved our technical problem.
Maybe
So,
play the very end. Just skip to the end.
okay, how many minutes?
Just a couple minutes. We've run out of time, basically.
All right, let's hear the last 2.5 minutes.
Very good. Yay, cymbal player. Bravo, Mid-Coast. Bravo, Mid-Coast. That was fun. That was so fun.
Bravo, George. Bravo.
Oh, Rowan, thank you. That was just
That
such
was,
a treat. What a great evening.
what a great evening. What an extraordinary. Well, I'm so glad we got a chance to really learn about this piece, how amazing it is. And I've got to say, George, it was just thrilling to hear you again playing that. It was a great performance at Orion. I think the
Yeah,
audience obviously loved it.
very
Thank you
much.
so very, very much. It's been great to dig into this music.
Well, you definitely did your research. I appreciated your not only insights, but the probing questions. It really made me think quite a bit, and in a different way. I learned some important distinctions, and I have new questions now about not only the Rhapsody, but really the evolution of American music itself. Nationalism was on the rise already back in the 19th century. In pretty much every major country that had a conservatory or symphony orchestra, you know, Glinka and the Big Five eventually in Russia, and the French composers of the late 19th century, Debussy, Ravel, Fauré, Saint-Saëns. I mean, and you know, then there's Gershwin, Copland, Bernstein. I mean, each finding their voice, finding their way, and the battle for what was American music was definitely in full swing at that point.
Well, thank you again, George. And to our audience, I wanted to let you know that we will be having another session with our next guest will be trumpeter Wayne Dumaine. And Wayne, we'll be listening to and discussing the Tomasi trumpet concerto and probably some of the other concertos that he has performed. And we'll be talking about his life. Actually, he's another musician who bridges the jazz and classical genres. So thank you again, George, and thank you to all our listeners and supporters for keeping the interest in orchestral music and classical music alive. And we'll look forward to meeting again online in early March. Thank you very much.